This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hallo und willkommen im Linguistics Podcast. Mein Name ist Chris und heute werden wir über grammatische Kasusmarkierung sprechen. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris and today we're going to talk about grammatical case marking. And the reason for the German introduction is because German is a language which has a fairly rich system of case marking, and so we'll look at it as one of our examples today. Now, what is case marking and why should we care? Well, as it turns out, in the languages of the world, there is a sort of continuum, between two extreme language types, all right? Now, what we need to keep in mind is that the point of language overall is to get a message across from person A to person B and to communicate that message effectively and with a certain amount of efficiency, all right? And so one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you don't have a lot of ambiguity in phrases, right? You want to make sure that you can sort of pin down what's being said at all times. And different languages will go about that different ways. And some languages are very heavily into word order. Okay, so the word order is relied upon to get the message across. And other languages use a different strategy, which is called case marking. Okay, and what this means is that typically every noun phrase in a phrase will be marked somehow with some sort of either a morphological marker that denotes its function in the sentence. And these functions often mirror what are called thematic roles. Okay, so first of all, cross-linguistically, remember that different languages will use case marking to a different extent. Some don't use it at all, some use it very rarely, some use it almost exclusively, and we'll take a look at some languages that fit and where they fit into this continuum, I should say. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, we need to go over the concept of thematic roles so that we understand what we mean by function in the sentence. Okay, now let's take a sentence such as Sally hit Greg. Okay, now if you excuse the violent example, Sally hit Greg is a perfectly fine English sentence, and we can note a couple things about this sentence. First of all, we can note that Sally and Greg are in a relation, which is described by the verb hit, right? So the verb hit describes a relation between two entities, one of which hits the other, if you will. Okay, that's simple enough. Now, in that relation, Sally and Craig serve different roles. Okay, this is what we mean when we talk about thematic roles. Now, Sally is the hitter, and Craig is the hittee. We can think of it that way, right? And in thematic roles, we would say that Sally is the agent. In other words, she is controlling the verb. And Craig is the patient. He's being acted upon. All right? Those are basic thematic roles. Agent and patient are talked about all the time. You can have other ones. You can have things like instrument. You can have beneficiary. So I gave the dog a bone. Clearly the dog is the beneficiary of the act. The bone in that case is sometimes referred to as the theme because it's being passed from one thing to another, or it undergoes a change of state. Okay, these are thematic roles, and they're only really loosely related to case marking. However, the relation is important, and it's helpful to understand what we're talking about when we talk about sentence functions. Okay, so let's keep agent and patient in mind, and we're also going to keep in mind beneficiary. Okay, now then, where does case come into this? Well, let's go back to Sally hit Craig. And let's, instead of Sally and Craig, let's use pronouns in place of them. So she hit him, right? She hit him. Now, English is actually very, very strict about word order. Okay, English is one of these languages that would fit in more on the word order side of this scale between word order and case marking. As a result, if you take Sally hit Craig and you change it to Craig hit Sally, you change the agent and the patient role. Right, Craig becomes the agent, Sally becomes the patient. However, if we look at she hit him, we note something interesting going on with the pronouns. So we can say she hit him, but if we then flip the agent and the patient, we find that we get different pronouns. We get he hit her. We don't get him hit she, right? That would be backwards. We get he hit her instead of him hit she. And what's going on there? Well, as it turns out, pronouns are one of the only situations in which English will sort of exhibit a kind of case marking. Okay, and what's happening is you're saying, okay, well, we know that because of word order, the agent comes before the patient in this particular construction. Therefore, you have to have a pronoun that is of the correct case in that position. So you can't use him, which is a pronoun that matches up with the case that in this case matches up with the patient, because if you're putting it first, you have to have one that matches up with the agent. Okay? So that should be fairly easy to wrap your head around, and it'll become a little bit clearer in a second. All right. Like I said, English does not really denote grammatical case that much. It really puts the focus on word order. However, other languages will sort of bear this out in a little bit clearer way. And so I wanted to sort of bring one of those languages into the fray, and that is, of course, German. Did the German introduction because I think the German has one of the clearest examples of a case marking system that is out there that's not Latin, because Latin has some other things that sort of make it confusing, right? So let's take a look at a German sentence, okay? The German sentence that we're going to look at means essentially the doctor gave the man the pill. Okay, so first let's look at it in English. The doctor gave the man the pill. It's pretty simple. We have a doctor who is an agent, right? He is doing the giving. The man is a recipient, and the pill is the patient or the theme, whichever you want to use in this case. That's why I say that thematic roles are only loosely related, but they're good for describing these roles that things are playing in the sentence, right? So in German, we could say something like, Der Doktor hat dem Mann die Pille gegeben. Okay? Now, I'm going to have to give you a little background on German in order to understand what's going on here, okay? Now, German not only marks for case on the determiner, so in other words, the German word for the can be either der, die, or das, depending on the gender of the noun. That's really unimportant for us today. What it also does is it will change based on case, okay? So there are three cases at play, and we know that there should be because there's really three thematic roles at play here. So first we have der Doktor. This is in what is called nominative case. Okay, and nominative case is generally restricted to sentential subjects, or if you will, the subject of a finite verb, if you want to really get into it. So the subject of the verb give, who is doing the giving, they are a nominative case, and indeed we find that der Doktor puts it in nominative case. Then we have dem Mann, D-E-M, man. Dame is in what is known as dative case, and dative case, one of the things that it can correspond to is beneficiary or recipient, okay? And dame is the dative marker, and it's marking man, right? And the man, as we know, is the recipient of the pill, right? Now let's look at pill. Die Pille. Die is actually used in more than one case in German, but in this case, or in this situation, I should say, for clarity, it marks accusative case, okay? And accusative is the case that is generally associated with objects, okay? And in this case, in this situation, it would be marking the patient or the theme, right? So the pill being passed from the doctor to the man, the pill is then an accusative case. Okay. Now, why do we care about this? Why is this important? Well, we know that right now it's not that different from English, right? So we can say the doctor has given the man the pill in English. And in German, we don't have that much difference. You'll note that the verb is moved to the end, but otherwise, it's almost a one-to-one correspondence here. Der Doktor hat dem Mann die Pille gegeben. Okay, so it's literally, the doctor has the man the pill given in German, okay? Don't worry about the verb moving to the end. That's for different reasons. The point is, the cases don't seem to be doing much right there, right? Because we can tell from the word order already what the associations are. Where it comes interesting is when you realize that because these cases are marked, you can move the words around and mean the same thing. Okay, and this is something English cannot do because English is not marking for case. Okay, so you can say, what we already had, der Doktor hat dem Mann die Pille gegeben. That's fine. So it goes doctor, man, pill, and it means the doctor gave the man the pill. You can also say, der Doktor hat die Pille dem Mann gegeben. Okay, now what we've done is we've changed the order of pill and man. So we've said the doctor gave the pill the man. And it still means the doctor gave the man the pill. Okay, now remember that English can't switch the word order like this and keep the same meaning. German can. And further, you could go, you could say something like, and to get this one, we'd have to put it in something like a past tense. So you could say, dann hat die Pille der Doktor dem Mann gegeben. Okay, now that's it would be considered slightly awkward in German, I believe. It's what we call non-canonical. However, it is grammatically correct. So now we put the pill first, the doctor second, and the man third, but we keep the same case markings on each noun, and therefore we don't change the meaning of the sentence. And now something should be, a light bulb should be going off in your head, and you should be saying, if this is the first time you've heard about grammatical case marking, all of a sudden you've answered the question as to why some languages are referred to as having a free word order. Okay? It's because some languages mark for case, and so it doesn't matter where you put things in the sentence, in the clause, they still come out with the same meaning, right? And this is an important concept. So languages that are far over to the right side of the continuum, that use case marking exclusively, will generally have either completely free or at least partially free word order. Now, German is a language that has partially free word order. It still has restrictions on where you can put the verb, for example, in a sentence. So it doesn't have completely free word order. Now, you can imagine what you would need to have a language with completely free word order. You'd have to not only mark your nouns, but you'd also have to mark other things that are not nouns so that you know what everything is in the sentence, right? But theoretically possible with this kind of marking, right? So that's what case marking is. It's a way for a language to get its point across without having to worry about what order constituents are placed in. Japanese is another fantastic example of a case marking language. So Japanese, essentially the only restriction in a Japanese clause is that the verb come at the very end, because Japanese is an SOV language, and it's very strictly verb final. Okay, so the verb must come at the end. But otherwise, other things don't really matter. And in Japanese, you mark things with postpositions. So they add things to the end of words to mark for case. So things like ni is a sort of directional marker, and it essentially shows what would generally be a dative case, right? So you say something like, let's see, gakko ni. Gakko ni would mean to school, essentially, in Japanese. And it's marked for that particular case. You have also a topicalizer in Japanese, which sort of roughly equates to nominative case, and you've also got a strict nominative ending of either wa or ga. Let's use ga in this example. So ga is definitely a nominative case, and you can say something like watashi ga. That means that I, me, am marking myself as nominative case, the subject of the verb. Okay, so you can say something like watashi ga gakko ni ikimasu, and that means I go to the school, right? That's perfectly fine. Nothing weird there. I go to the school. Now, you can flip those first two words around. You can say gakko ni watashi ga ikimasu, and you mean the same thing, crucially. Okay, you can flip those first two elements around, and you don't change the meaning of the sentence. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about case marking. Let me give you one other example. Perhaps the most famous example of a case marking language is Latin. Latin, of course, is commonly referred to as a dead language. What does it mean to be a dead language? Well, in general, it means that it's believed that there are no more native speakers of Latin. Now, of course, if you know anything about language history, you know that Latin is the mother language for all the Romance languages. So it's not so much that all the native speakers died off, but they simply started speaking other varieties of it, which eventually evolved into things like French and Spanish. However, in Latin, there was a very rich case marking system that did not make it into these daughter languages. So in Latin, for example, one of the nominative endings of the first declension, and I'll explain what that means in a second, was right? So just a letter A, if you want to think of it that way. It had a genitive and dative case ending of AE, or A, I guess it would be. I've never studied Latin, by the way, so I'm sorry if I'm botching these pronunciations. That's why I'm just giving letters. Accusative case, AM. Ablative case, a long A. And vocative case, I suppose this would be a short A, or the same as the nominative case, essentially. So that's pretty clear, right? I mean, that's a pretty rich case marking system. It's got cases that I haven't even mentioned here, and that maybe I'll mention in a later podcast. But the reason I didn't want to use Latin exclusively as our example language is not only because I haven't studied it, so my pronunciation would certainly be horrible, but the fact that Latin also has different declension classes of nouns, which affect the endings you use. Okay, so it's got not only essentially one complete case marking system, but several complete case marking systems, one for each declension. Okay, one for each noun type. So that's a little bit dirtier, I think. It's a little bit more complex than I wanted to go over today. And German, I think, was a little bit cleaner example. Okay. So, one final word on some things about case marking. As I mentioned, Latin had a very rich case marking system, but the Romance languages really, in general, don't have a rich case marking system. In fact, French really just sort of has the same kind of thing as English does. If you use pronouns, then you see some case differentiation, but nowhere else. Certainly not on every noun, right? So what happened? Why don't we see this? Especially in the case of English, right? Because English started originally as a Germanic tongue, had tons of input from Latinate languages, primarily through French, and yet still ends up with pretty much no case marking system to speak of. How does this happen? Well, languages will just sort of use more or less as time goes on, and you find it's almost a pendulum effect. A language will go over and be almost exclusively in the realm of not case marking, so in the realm of word order. And then over time, it will sort of go the other way, and it'll sort of go back and forth in a lot of cases. So the fact that Latin had it and its daughters do not is not surprising. Okay, it's not a surprising fact. We would expect then, if this sort of pendulum effect is true, that over time, thousands of years, of course, that what is now modern day French or Spanish will turn into something that may mark for case. I mean, it's one of those things that's kind of hard to tell, but it is not. It's not true that if a language doesn't mark for case today, it's never going to mark for case, right? This is one of those things that's dependent upon language evolution, and it really is a continuum, right? Most languages are in the middle of the range between completely reliant on word order and completely reliant on case marking. Very few languages are on the outside edges, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so that has been case marking. I hope that's been interesting for all of you. As always, I'd like to encourage you to send me an email at linguistchris@gmail.com with suggestions for topics that you want to hear talked about on this podcast. I'd also like to thank all of you for your wonderful, wonderful comments that I've received on Twitter and via email. A lot of you think that this is a great podcast to listen to, and that it's a great, I think somebody mentioned it was a great refresher if you've already had previous experience with linguistics. And so I thank you for all those comments, and I do hope that y'all keep them coming. Give me feedback. Tell me what you want to hear about. It's such a huge field. I always find myself sort of grasping at straws for what I want to cover next. So if you have an idea, please drop me a line, and I will definitely cover it in a future podcast. All right. So thank you as always. You can reach me, like I said, linguistchris@gmail.com or twitter.com/linguistchris. And I will hopefully, metaphorically speaking, see you guys next time. Thanks again.